Today's book is The Secret Chord by Geraldine Brooks. Geraldine? I think it's pronounced Geraldine. I'd never really heard of this book or this author until a couple months ago, but my mom was reading this book for her book club. And my mom actually really likes this author. She's written a number of other books, March, Year of Wonders, People of the Book, that my mom has enjoyed in the past. This book, if you've never heard of it before, and I hadn't, it's about the King David story, like the King David story from the Bible in the Old Testament. And it's a novel based on the kind of biblical narrative. And that immediately interested me because I have been interested, ever since I was a boy, I guess, in the King David story. In fact, I'm probably more interested or more fascinated by kind of the source material, the biblical story of King David, than I am in this retelling of it, although this retelling of it was not bad. But fair warning, this book review could get a little bit muddled. I'd like to talk about both kind of the original source material that Geraldine Brooks is kind of building off of it, and also maybe review this book and kind of talk about my own history, kind of growing up with the Bible stories. And this is all going to be unscripted as usual, for better or for worse, and this camera has a 30-minute time limit. So wherever I am at the end of 30 minutes, I'll just cut myself off. The time limit is, I didn't realize this when we first started using this camera, but I've decided it's just as well. Like, I could go on for 3 hours on some of these things if somebody would let me. So 30-minute time limit. I didn't set that setting on the camera, but that's probably just as well. So I grew up in the church, in Sunday school. I also attended kind of private Christian schools where Bible was a subject that we kind of studied every day. I probably got more of my knowledge of the Bible from kind of private Christian schools, but you know, like Sunday school as well. And these Bible stories were taught to us as history, initially from kind of like kindergarten to first and second grade. It was like story time. We'd all kind of sit down on the floor and the teacher would show us pictures and kind of tell the stories with telling pictures. And I loved it. Like, I've always loved stories. Some of the Bible stories are a little bit strange, but you know, kids love any kind of stories. And then as I got older, I was very interested in it. I developed an interest in ancient history around the time I was, 10, 11, 12, middle school age-ish. And it's a bit kind of difficult psychoanalyzing yourself and figuring out why are you interested in the things you're interested in. I mean, some stuff you're really just kind of drawn to, and it's very difficult to kind of think of a rhyme or reason for it. The ancient history correlated very well with the Bible. Because the Bible kind of goes through ancient history. So you have, you know, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, Greeks a little bit, although the Greeks kind of mostly happened during that 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then the Roman Empire. And I'm not quite sure even to this day which was the chicken and which was the egg. Like, did I become interested in ancient history because I had these Bible stories to kind of put it in context? Or as I became interested in ancient history around kind of 6th, 7th, 8th grade, did that maybe increase my interest in the Bible stories? Because, you know, I remember after I became, just as an example, after I became really interested in Roman history, I took an increased interest in the book of Acts. Because, you know, Acts kind of, Paul is going all throughout the Roman world and he's interacting with the Roman bureaucracy and stuff like that. Paul himself was a Roman citizen. So I've been interested in these stories, first of all, just kind of as a story time perspective. As I got older, I was interested in it because of the connection with ancient history. As I grew older, I became an agnostic at some point, but I'm still kind of fascinated by these stories, and I've been trying to kind of seek out books and lectures and kind of videos which kind of parse what's myth and what's reality from the Bible stories. There's some very interesting stuff on this. Just briefly kind of mention some of the stuff. There's a book I read by Robin Lane Fox called The Unauthorized Version, which is somewhat of an unfortunate title because it makes it sound like it's, like a Dan Brown, like tabloid conspiracy. But the title aside, it's a work. Robin Lane Fox is a very respected classicist, a respected scholar in his field. And he writes a book about the history of the Bible, kind of what lines up with established history and what doesn't. Also, Yale University has these open courses series where you can kind of listen to all the lectures from a Yale course. They've got one course on the Old Testament by Christian Hayes, another course on the New Testament by Dale Martin. I found these courses absolutely fascinating. There's also some other Bart Ehrman's books, and I'm not going to give a whole bibliography here actually. But finding out kind of what's historical and what's not. Now, as with anything, the farther back you get into kind of ancient history, the more debate there is around these kind of things. But we do know that parts of the historical narrative in the Bible line up very well with outside histories, kind of the fall of Jerusalem at the end of kind of 2 Kings. If you know your Bible stories, you know that that's when the Babylonians are coming and the Egyptians are coming, and kind of the kingdom of Judah is caught in the middle. Oh geez, I hope I'm getting this right. Maybe it was the fall of the northern kingdoms that had the Assyrians and the Egyptians. Anyways, Robin Lane Fox said in his book, this lines up very well with what we know from both the Assyrian texts and the Egyptian texts. And the kind of accounting kind of 2 Kings just kind of collaborates what we also know from outside history. Now, as you get farther back in time, this kind of gets more speculative, and then there are points where the Bible just doesn't seem to line up with kind of archaeology and history at all, like the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan and stuff like that. So it's hypothesized that the Old Testament as we know it was kind of edited together in the period after the exile, around 4 BC, kind of 4 centuries before Christ. Sorry, not 4 BC, 4th century BC. Exactly when it was edited together from older material that the editor was actually drawing together. Now, when this older material was written is kind of subject to debate. Biblical scholars, kind of starting in the 19th century with kind of German scholars, have kind of 4 sources for the Old Testament narratives, which there's the Eloise source or the E source, the Yahweh source, which is called the J source because it was German scholars who invented this, so Jehovah, the priestly source or the P source, and the Deuteronomistic Historian. And the Deuteronomistic Historian, in addition to being a source, is also kind of the editor who's kind of bringing this material and shaping it together. And he's writing after the exile to try and kind of figure out why God allowed the kingdom of Israel to be destroyed. Or kingdom of Judah, I guess. Both kingdoms, really. And so he's kind of looking back on this history to kind of put a religious spin on it. And he's called the Deuteronomistic Historian because he's one of the main authors of the book of Deuteronomy, which is where, if you read Deuteronomy, this kind of covenant gets set up between God and the people of Israel. You follow my commandments, I'm going to make you prosperous in this land. You don't follow my commandments, you're going to get in trouble with your enemies, and I'm going to leave you to your enemies, and they're going to conquer you. So you follow me, you're going to be victorious over the other people in this land. You don't follow me, trouble's going to happen. And then once this polemic is set out, then kind of all the historical books afterwards, Joshua, Judges, Ruth is an exception. Maybe I'll talk about Ruth later if I have more time. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings kind of follow this polemic where the Israelites fall away from God, they stop following him, then their enemies come in and they get captured, conquered by their enemies. Then they realize, oh no, what are we doing? And then they pray to God, and then God says, okay, go out, I'll give you victory over your enemies. And then everyone's happy, and then they forget about God and start worshiping idols again, and then the enemies come in, and then... So this is what's kind of going on all the way like through Judges, where these kind of prophets or judges keep getting raised up by God to save Israel from their enemies. And Israel gets into this mistake because they've kind of worshipped false gods. This is what's going on through 1st and 2nd Kings. I said 1st and 2nd Samuel before, but that's a mistake, and that's on my part. That's an exception, 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's an interesting exception because when we get into the King David story, we break away from this polemic. Instead, what we have is this kind of story of the rise of King David, kind of the reign of King David, and then the struggles over who is going to succeed King David. Because King David has a lot of sons who are all kind of fighting with each other. He also has kind of people in his household. There's 3 brothers from his sister. I think his sister's name is Zariah, I forget. And she's got 3 sons who are kind of the leaders of King David's military. The most prominent of which is Joab. And then there's Abishai and what was the other one's name? Asahel. And they are involved in some of these conspiracies as well. And for large, there is moralizing going on here, like when the David and Bathsheba thing, kind of Nathan comes in and kind of condemns David, you've sinned against God. There's this bizarre incident which gets left out of this novel when David decides to count up how many men he has in his army, and for some reason this gets God really angry. But there are also large sections where God just kind of fades away into the background, and it appears you're reading just kind of this political struggle within Israel, like this civil war between kind of King David and King Saul, and then after King Saul dies, the civil war is not over because it's still King David against the house of Saul. Ishbosheth is one of Saul's sons is left in charge. And then kind of the struggle among King David's sons, where it's not like very kind of clear. The normal polemic has kind of gotten forgotten. And instead we've got these political squabbles, political battles, fights for the political control of Israel, which take center stage. And then King David dies. There's a struggle for his succession, in which King Solomon and, what's his name, Adoniah, the other son. And then we get back to the kind of regular polemic. So, because this source, the King David story, kind of breaks the normal polemic, and because it shows such intimate knowledge of the court of King David, it's been called by biblical scholars the court history. And it's hypothesized that maybe somebody in King David's court actually wrote this kind of history because they seem to have intimate details of what's going on. And even some like atheist historians, like Robin Lane Fox, believe this, that the King David narrative kind of comes from an authentic source, the court history. Now, Robin Lane Fox, he's an atheist. He makes a distinction between the early King David stories and the later King David stories. The early King David stories were like he kills a giant and he's kind of, like this golden boy and stuff like that. Robin Lane Fox says, no, that's too kind of once and future king type stuff. It's too much of the narrative of the chosen boy. So Robin Lane Fox says, okay, that is from a later period. But the stuff about King David as king, when he's kind of king, it doesn't seem like they're mythologizing him. In fact, he seems kind of weak. He's indecisive. He can't control his sons. He can't control his generals. There are all these rebellions kind of coming up against him. If you read 2 Samuel, I think there are two popular rebellions. First one is led by his son Absalom. Second one, I forget the name of the guy, but somebody just says, okay, some popular rebellion by another guy. And in these popular rebellions, David kind of loses the support of the people, and they all kind of go over to the other guy both times, which indicates he's not a very good king, or at the very least, he's not very popular with the people. So it looks like, it almost seems like he's a really kind of terrible king. But then as you get into the prophets and all the later books, they look back on this as a golden age, and they're talking about, oh, how wonderful King David was and stuff like that. So Robin Lane Fox is saying, okay, as we kind of move away from the period of King David, we can see he's getting mythologized, and all this praise is kind of putting on him. But this period where David is kind of a weak and indecisive king, that couldn't have been written in the later period. That must have been from when he was, that must have been kind of a contemporary thing. Now, so that's a reason why Robin Lane Fox kind of thinks the King David narrative is authentic, and other scholars, both secular scholars and religious scholars, kind of go along with that. And Geraldine Brooks goes along with that as well. She says, David is the first man in literature whose story is told in detail from childhood to extreme old age. Some scholars have called this biography the oldest piece of history writing, predating Herodotus by at least half a millennium. Now, Herodotus, I think, wrote in around 500 BC. The Old Testament was not compiled until the 4th century BC, but if we assume that the court history is contemporary with David, which not everybody does, but some people do, if we assume that, then this could be true. Then we have like the first biography in history kind of predating Herodotus by 500 years. And that's fascinating to consider. Now, sorry, let me read the next sentence here as well. Outside of the pages of the Bible, however, David has left little trace. That's true. A single engraving uncovered at Tel Dan's mentions his house. Some buildings of the Second Iron Age period might have been associated with the leader of his stature. I think actually, if I remember right, there's a couple other engravings that have been uncovered that have mentioned his house. But none of these are contemporary with which David would have lived. In other words, they're not from 1000 BC, they're from like 800. And they mention his house, but like, you know, it could be like King Arthur or Romulus or any kind of these other mythical old kings. It doesn't mean they actually existed. It just means that the myth of the ancestry to this person was established by that point. That being said, yeah, he might have existed, yeah. Then she says, I tend to agree with Duff Cooper, I don't know who that is, but somebody, who concluded that David must actually have existed, for no people would invent such a flawed figure for a national hero. Which is what atheist Robin Fox thinks as well. Like the story of King David as we had it in 2 Samuel is so flawed. Who would invent this? Now, there is a counterpoint to this. And the counterpoint is that the figure of kind of the flawed, tragic king is an archetypal figure in mythology. King Arthur, his story arc is actually kind of very similar to King David, right? He starts out as a golden boy, then as he gets older, he becomes old and weak, and he can't control his own household, and it's his own son who comes against him, and his nephews are coming against him, just like in the King David story. King Arthur was written in the Christian period, so I don't know, maybe that's not a coincidence that his story arc so carefully mirrors King David. Maybe the authors were just kind of copying it. But there are that's just one example. There are other examples. I mean, King Lear was also in the Christian period. But like, if you go back to the Greeks, there's a lot of Greek heroes who had kind of very tragic old ages. Ovidus Rex, for example. Now, his kind of tragic flaw was built into the story right from his birth, with that prophecy and stuff like that. But it's a story of kind of a hero who kind of gets undone in his old age, or kind of Jason from Jason and the Argonauts. You remember he goes on all these big adventures and he gets the golden fleece, and then as an old kind of king, he's completely ineffectual and he gets betrayed by his own kind of household. And I think there are Agamemnon. There are all these examples from Greek mythology, which kind of show that this kind of very flawed hero, just because you have a flawed hero, even if he's a national symbol. I mean, a lot of these Greek heroes were national symbols for their own city-states. King Arthur was a national symbol. Even if he's a national symbol, doesn't mean because it's a flawed story, it necessarily has historical validity. But on the other hand, it could. I mean, like, I'm presenting both sides of this here because I genuinely haven't made up my own mind myself, and it's one of those things where you can't really make up your own mind. You just have to say, well, it could be historical. It doesn't have to be historical, but like, it certainly could be historical. Now, the other piece of the equation is the archaeological evidence, which has not matched up with the biblical account. In the books of Samuel, it looks like David has this kind of huge kingdom, well established. The archaeology does not show that the kingdom of Israel had that kind of reach during the time we'd associate with King David's reign, and that King David, if he existed, was kind of more of a local chieftain over kind of parts of Judah, perhaps. So you'd have to adjust the story that way, but the core elements of the story could be true, just kind of on a much smaller scale. All this stuff I find fascinating. I'm sorry, I'm completely still talking about the background and I haven't even gotten to the book. The King David story is fascinating as a story as well. There's a lot of epicness kind of trapped within the story. There's a lot of very interesting things that you could call them like Shakespearean, or they'd be worthy of kind of the Greek tragedies or stuff like that. I mean, if you're familiar with the story, you know King David gets betrayed by his own sons. I mean, that's kind of Shakespeare or a Greek tragedy for you right there, right? There's conflicting loyalties, like Jonathan, King Saul's son. He's friends with David, and yet his father is the one who's trying to kill David. So, like, does Jonathan follow the filial duty to support his father, or does he support his friend? There's King David has conflicted feelings because he loves Saul and Jonathan, yet he has to go and kind of fight against them. There's a lot of backstabbing and stuff like that, especially like when King David becomes king and he can't control what's going on in his household. His general Joab is kind of killing the other generals, Abner and Amasa. His sons are killing each other. I mean, like, I know comparisons to Game of Thrones are a cliche, but I think, boy, this could be the next Game of Thrones, really. Especially like the squabbles inside David's household. Like people always say, Game of Thrones, people are always getting killed out of nowhere, and it's really shocking. In the King David narrative, people are always getting killed out of nowhere, and it could be really shocking. There are a couple problems with this story as it's written in the Bible that prevent the reader from getting kind of fully immersed into it. And one is just the style of the biblical narrative. Now, Christian Hayes, in her lectures on the Old Testament, talks about this. She references a book, which I have not read, called The Art of Biblical Narrative. But I'm familiar with the book through her summary of it. Where kind of, if you go through these Old Testament narratives, the narrator really does not give you any of the details you'd want to know. Now, she uses the story in her lectures of Abraham and Isaac as her example. You know, like the story, Abraham's going to sacrifice Isaac, and she says, we don't know how old Isaac is. Is he a child, or is he kind of like, you know, like 19? We don't know, is Isaac struggling, or is he just kind of going along with this? Is he yelling out, or is he calm about his fate? Like, just kind of none of the details we get. And she, even though she uses that example, you could use the same, you could make the same complaint really all the way through the King David story, where you're just getting this reports like, oh, by the way, so-and-so killed so-and-so. Like when Job killed Amasa in 2 Samuel. So Amasa comes out, Job goes to greet him. Amasa doesn't know what's going on. Job kind of grabs him by the beard and then plunges the dagger into his belly. And then like the troops just kind of march on, and Amasa's just kind of left in the ground with his intestines coming out. That's not me being graphic, by the way. That's right there in the Bible. And why does Job kill him? It's like it's never explained in the Bible. So people have to kind of guess. And this, yeah, I mean, I remember growing up when I was kind of studying the Bible in school, we'd always be asking questions like, what? Why? What's going on? Why? And you know, the Bible teachers, I think what they should have done maybe is just say, I don't know, kids. Nobody knows. It's just some bizarre story. But they would try to explain the story to us and try to find some reason in it. And I think that, I don't know, maybe that's kind of falling into a trap of assuming these stories are explainable. But that always, it left me with the impression that there is kind of a narrative in these stories. You just have to kind of tease it out. Is the impression I got left with from childhood. So, all the better for a novelist to kind of come along and try and tease out these stories. And she does a great job. Like the example I just mentioned when Joab kills Amasa, she goes through and she kind of gives Joab all the motivation in the world to want to kill Amasa by the time you get to that point. The other problem with the stories is everything happens twice. Now, not everything, almost everything happens twice. Lots of stuff happens twice. Now again, this is not only the King David stories, this goes all the way through the Old Testament. Like Genesis 1 and 2 have two different creation stories. Abraham kind of lies about Sarah being his sister twice. Noah's Ark story, if you read it, has a lot of the same descriptions in it twice. All the way through the Old Testament, but it's especially noticeable in the King David stories. And it's especially noticeable in the young King David stories, like the kind of once and future king type stuff. It's not so noticeable once you get to the court history section of it. But in the young King David stories, King David is like, Saul loses God's favor twice. I think David is anointed king twice. David comes to Saul's attention twice. Goliath gets killed twice in two kind of different sections of the narrative. Saul turns against David twice. I think Saul tries to kill David twice. David flees twice. David finds kind of Saul sleeping on the ground and spares his life twice. All these things happen twice. Now apparently what's going on is when these stories were being compiled in the 4th century, there were several different versions of these stories floating around, and the compiler of the story was reluctant to lose either one of them. They had both become important enough in tradition that to kind of leave one out would have been, I don't know, it would have been unacceptable. So he includes both versions of the story. Now there's an interesting, Grant Voth in his kind of history of world literature thinks this is fascinating, that you have two different versions of the same story. But it's a challenge kind of as a reader to make sense of it all. I'm out of time. The 30-minute time limit is coming on, and I haven't even gotten to the book. I knew this would happen, but I'm just going to cut myself off here and call this good.